If I asked the people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Henry Ford, Goodreads.com. And I just think this is a really good quote because people in that day and age, they weren't looking for an automobile. I mean, that wasn't even really a thought. I mean, they had them, they were down, but I mean, like they were too expensive for anybody to buy. So all they wanted was it was just like something you'd think was impractical. You didn't really need it. Now, Henry Ford, he did more than give people faster horses. He changed our country. The assembly line being used on a mass scale and producing a car for anybody to own. He was an entrepreneur and a hard worker. Could very well be the most influential person of the 20th century. Now, first off, Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863. He was the oldest of 6 children between Mary and William Ford. And he grew up in Dearborn, Michigan on a prosperous family farm. In 1891, Ford became an engineer with the Edison Illumination Company in Detroit. This was from hmfgv.org. He took his extra time and money after being promoted to chief engineer in 1893 and experimented with internal combustion engines, so like engines powered by gasoline. With the result of his experiments, he developed his first self-propelled vehicle, the quadricycle. Now, it had 4 wire wheels that looked a lot like wheels from a bike. It was steered with a tiller, like on a boat, and it had 2 gears. Slow, fast. They didn't have reverse. Now Ford was not the first person to ever develop a self-propelled vehicle using gasoline, but he was one of the pioneers that turned our nation into a country of motorists. Now that you know a little bit about Ford's early life, let me bring you into the world of failure and success. Now, Ford had many failed attempts to establish a company. Quote, "Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, and this time more intelligently." Henry Ford, Brainy.com. Now, everyone knows when you start up a company, especially when you're pretty young, it requires a lot of money. And when Ford started off, he didn't have any money. So he was looking for investors. And he found the Dodge brothers. Now, they didn't have any money. Like, they grew up actually very poor, but I mean, they just set up a factory, so they had money. Not a lot, but enough. Now, their original investment in Ford to get him started was $7,000 in 1902. And in return, they got 10% of Ford's company. He sold them a share of stock. And they also got a big contract to help him manufacture some of his goods. And they already had a factory, so they set up one of their factories to produce his cars. Now, their factories weren't for cars, but they turned them into that. Now, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated only a year after he got his funds, so he was right here. Now, Ford realized his dream, after incorporating his company, to produce an automobile that was affordable for the common man, reliable, and efficient. Now, Ford created the Model T in 1896, but it wasn't actually released to the public until 1908. They sold for a little over $300, and which in today's time that equivalents out to like $7,000. So I'm kind of wondering what happened, because if you go to buy a new Ford today, it's not $7,000. By 1918, more than half the cars in America were Model Ts. Ford had a high demand for the Model T, and in 1913, he created the moving assembly line. Also from hmfgv.org. Now, some people think that Ford invented the assembly line. He didn't invent the assembly line. I mean, he invented the moving assembly line. But I mean, so before Ford showed up, right, you're going to have a guy standing here in a car on a table or some kind of platform, and he'll put the same piece on this car. So it's really inefficient, because then he's got to walk all the way over here to put another piece on this car. So that was wasting a lot of time. When he needed a new part, he'd have to go back and get one. So he had everybody set up to just stay in their spot. And right there you can see that he's got that's a big motor that turns it, and I obviously wasn't there, so I'm not 100% positive, but I think it works a lot like when you take your car through a drive-in car wash. I mean, the motors just move the cars down the line, and you got your bins over there where you got your parts in, so you can just put them on. Now, Ford's employees worked for $5 a day, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it equivalents out to exactly what they made in 2011, which was $110 per day. And I mean, for a factory worker and the common industrialist, I mean, that's pretty good money. In 1919, Ford bought the 10% of his company back from the Dodge brothers. Now, this was only, what, like 16-ish years? I didn't do the math right in my head, but they bought it back for $25 million. So $7,000 to $25 million in like 16 years, it kind of gives you a guess on how well Ford's company was doing to make that kind of stock increase. This was found at meadowbrookhall.org. Alright, finally, how many of you have heard of the V8 engine? Now, Ford revolutionized the automotive world when introducing the V8. Quote, when Henry Ford decided to produce his famous V8 motor, he chose to build an engine with the entire 8 cylinders cast in one block, and instructed his engineers to produce a design for this engine. This design was placed on paper, but the engineers agreed that it was simply impossible to cast an 8-cylinder engine block in one piece. Ford replied, produce it anyway. Goodreads.com. In the 1930s, Ford produced his flathead V8. It was pretty looking. Obviously, it looks pretty cool. Cheap. And very fast. This launched the American era for hot rods and custom cars. I mean, and this one right here, it says right there, it's a 1931 Ford Flathead. But I mean, they didn't look like that. I mean, I saw the ones on the internet. They didn't look like it's the same basic engine, but I mean, you didn't have the big piece on top. It's just yeah. In conclusion, Ford died on April 7th, 1947. At the age of 83. He was recognized as one of America's leading businessmen and is credited for helping build America's economy during its vulnerable early years. This is found at history.com, America's Story of Us video clip. Ford was way ahead of his time. He paid wages that were more than fair for his day and age, and he released a car that was affordable for the common man and bettered our growing economy. Henry Ford is the most influential person of the